Oh yes, it automatically says that now. It's just extremely irritating. Never mind. So it's lovely to see everybody on this sunny day. I think it's sunny virtually over the whole country. And so this week and next week, we have two special In Conversations with authors. Next week, we have Titania Michaels, who's talking about her book, Osha, which is quite a good short read for anybody who wants an afternoon read. And that's the In Conversation, which we had to postpone from a couple of weeks ago. So we're really pleased that Titania is joining us next week. But this week, we're very pleased to welcome Nadia Ragozhina, who also has her book, Worlds Apart. And joining her for In Conversation this morning is Fran, who some of you may well know, Fran Horwich, who gets around the country quite a lot in her role at AJR, Association of Jewish Refugees. But this morning, it's her role as a curator of part of the bookshelf behind me. And so I'm handing over the reins. And so morning to everybody, and I'm going to hand over to Fran to introduce Nadia and her book Worlds Apart.
Morning, everybody. Morning. It's nice to see everybody. And good morning, Nadia. And
morning.
Thank you so much for your great book. I'm just going to hold it up so that people can see it. It's a great read, and I can highly, highly recommend it. So thank you for that wonderful book. And I wondered if we could kick off maybe by asking you to describe an outline of the book.
Yes, absolutely. Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. So the book is, so on the cover, I'm just going to show it again. So you have two brothers. You have Adolphe. This is Adolphe, and this is Marcus. And Marcus is my great-grandfather. And so they were born and brought up in Warsaw, and they went their separate ways when they were young men. Adolphe left Warsaw in 1905, and Marcus followed several years later, and Adolphe went to Switzerland, and Marcus ended up going to Moscow. And I was born in Moscow. I'm Marcus's daughter, Anna, is my grandmother, who's still around. She's with us. She's 98 years old and lives in London. And so the two brothers split when they're different ways, and they actually lost touch. They stayed in touch. I mean, I'm going to go into more detail about what happened to each of them, but just basically to outline the bigger picture is that they lost touch from the 1930s. The contact was sporadic, and then they both passed away in the 50s, and that was it. So when I was growing up, we didn't know anything about the family in Switzerland other than very few photos that my grandmother kept as her precious archive, and would every now and then show us, but also she didn't want to talk too much about that family, and I will tell you why that was as well. And I found the Swiss relatives 10 years ago. I connected with them online. We met up. My grandmother met one of her first cousins for the very first time in her life. And that's kind of where it all started. We started learning about each other's families, what happened, over the course of the last 100 years, what happened to each side. And when the outline was becoming clear that, you have basically one family that separated and then came back together 100 years later, and everything that happened to us in Soviet Union and then in Russia, and everything happened on the other side in Switzerland, but also in Belgium and British mandated Palestine. When I saw all those stories, that's when I started thinking about the book. And this is basically the book that tells those stories of all these people, and how it came about. I also talk about how I was researching it and writing it in the book. So it was quite a big undertaking to put all this together and to make this happen.
And when you first started out researching your family, was your intention to write a book, or was it just to find out for the family's interest?
I think at the beginning I just wanted to find out for the family's interest, because I think I need to kind of go back into a little bit of context here. But basically, when Marcus went to Russia, I don't like saying went to Russia, because at the time when he went, Poland was still part of the Russian Empire. So when Marcus went east to Moscow, he went because he was an idealist. He became a communist during the First World War, during which he served in the Russian Imperial Army. And so he ended up in Moscow, and he had this dream, you know, a dream of freedom, a dream of equality, a dream of being able to do what he wanted. It was the first time in his life where he wasn't being defined by being Jewish, which had been the case in Warsaw. And he joined something that was called, that Lenin had created, which was called the New Economic Policy, which was meant to kickstart the Russian economy after the horrific years of the Civil War, and basically enabled people to trade. So he became a trader, and he was quite a small trader. He had a stall at the market, and he was just selling fabrics. But some of the NEP men, the ones who had contributed to this policy, they were quite big businessmen. They ran shops and employed lots of other people. And but that really did help the economy, actually, and it did really work for a few years. But then Lenin passed away, and Stalin decreed that that was not a communist policy to have, that it wasn't communist in its nature, and so they scrapped it. But they also declared that all people who had collaborated with it, they were all enemies of the people. And that's when the kind of repressions, persecutions really began for that kind of, you know, rising middle class in a sense. And Marcus was exiled. So that was, you know, only several years after arriving in Moscow and starting on his kind of dream life that his dreams were crushed. And I was growing up, I mean, just to kind of also finish telling the outlines of his story, he was exiled, but if you look at the bigger picture, he was in a sense lucky. And I don't want to use this word lightly, but he didn't get sent to a gulag in Siberia. He was sent to another city where he was able to live and work, and he had an apartment. But he wasn't allowed to go back to Moscow. He wasn't allowed to kind of see his family in Moscow, and the family who were left behind were stripped of all their possessions. So it was still an incredibly traumatic event for the family and for my grandmother, who was only 4 or 5 years old at the time. But that determined the rest of Marcus's life, because eventually he came back to Moscow and he was able to get a job, and he lived his last years there throughout the Second World War. But he was a completely shattered, you know, man. His idealism didn't survive the experience. He believed in the Soviet experiment, and that's what it did to him. But so that's kind of the backdrop to my growing up, because I grew up with my grandmother, my mum. We all grew up in a multi-generational Soviet home where all this was kind of still bubbling under the surface. So my grandmother had this archive of pictures that she had inherited from her father, of photos of her cousins that had been sent over in the 30s, while it was still okay, slightly dangerous, but it was still kind of allowed. And after everything that she had lived through with her father, but also other experiences that she'd had in post-Soviet Russia, there was this kind of tension of talking about the past. We didn't, you know, she would show me the photos, but she wouldn't have much to say, or she wouldn't really want to talk about them, because in her kind of experience, it was still traumatic and scary, because she didn't, you know, it was fine in the 90s when I was asking the questions, but she kind of couldn't get used to that idea. And so there was a lot of secrecy and kind of mystery surrounding the Swiss family. And my mum, who had grown up in the 60s and the 70s, she was also kind of experienced a very different life to mine. And she was fascinated with the idea of Switzerland. You know, to them, it seemed like paradise on earth. And they adored Adolf for, like, really respected him, revered almost, for making the right choice. That's how it was seen from our side, for going in the right direction, for making a life for himself and for providing for his family. Because the myth that I had grown up was that the Swiss family had a watch factory. I almost didn't believe it, because it just felt like so stereotypically Swiss. But eventually we found out that it was actually true. And so I grew up with these stories. I wanted to know more, but there wasn't more to be known, because they hadn't had contact for so long. But I also wanted to know about being Jewish. And that was the other thing that kind of added an extra layer to this, to me being fascinated, because they would always be very open and vocal about the fact that we were Jewish, and yes, we're Jewish and this is great, and you know, look at this musician and he's Jewish and you should listen to him playing whatever. But when I went further and said, okay, well, what does this mean? What is a menorah I had seen on the street? Like in, you know, when things were opening up and things were becoming more open and celebrated, they didn't actually know, because they had grown up in this atmosphere of fear and not talking about it. And my grandmother had also, because Marcus had become a communist, he never went to synagogue or anything. So my grandmother has never been to a synagogue in her life. So, and it was very similar on my father's side. So there were so many questions. So I think so that partly kind of inspired me to look for the Swiss family, because I wanted to know more, and through the mystery that I had seen it as like part of a mysterious story, I was discovering it.
The contrast of the Swiss family and their experience to the Russian family is so incredible. It was very moving to read that part where your grandfather had been banished, and your grandmother was sort of having to leave, and also the awful situation of having to share accommodation, which pervaded all across Russia, that people did not have an apartment of their own, that they were in sort of shared accommodation, contrasted with what was happening in Switzerland.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of contributed, because even before I knew that this was going to be a book, when we just met them and just had the outline of what happened to them, in my head, it was already like, this is amazing. You have the Russian side and everything that happened. And I do find that in the West, people tend to know a bit less about Russia, and especially the ordinary kind of experiences of what it was like trying to, you know, move into a bigger apartment, which happened twice, once to my grandmother, once to my mother, you know, I talk about those experiences. And then when I saw what was happening to them on the other side, and, you know, I will tell you a bit more about Adolph's kind of, you know, what happened to them. But, you know, there was Belgium, there was Palestine, and those experiences, and them running in parallel, and then the two families coming together. I think subconsciously, maybe I knew that it was going to be a book. I don't think I thought I would be the one writing it. I was hoping someone else would do the hard work. But I think I had an inkling that that it wasn't just an amazing story, and rare in a sense, because we do kind of read a lot of memoirs, you know, of separate events, or, you know, a lot of Holocaust memoirs, a lot of Russian memoirs, but I don't think I've actually come across another one that has two sides, East and West, in parallel, and where you can see how, you know, how lives were just, how ordinary people were impacted by the huge tumultuous political events that were surrounding them on all sides, affected from different angles in different times of history. So I think there's a lot of thought that went into this, but I think it was, yeah, quite cataclysmic.
And I think on the other side, because when you read a book, you read it obviously with the knowledge that you have, and you're reading about this family who are having a pretty idyllic life in Geneva, and then one of them goes to Belgium, and we know that that's not a good idea, because we have the benefit of hindsight, and that inside you're thinking, don't go.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then that all opens up. So do you want to talk a little bit about that part of the book?
Yes, so I was just thinking I should. So basically, when Adolphe left in 1905, he went west, and that was a lot less common. The route west was a lot less common for Jews fleeing the pogroms and the instability of Poland at the time. And the reason he went there is because he got married, and his sister had his wife's sister was already living in Switzerland. She'd gone to the mountainous region of the Jura, the future kind of, where at that time already they were establishing all the watch factories, the ateliers, the workshop, where it was all already happening. And she you know, wrote to her sister and she said, come here, there are jobs here, and it's peaceful and it's very quiet. And they did. And I think they wanted to start a family, obviously. 1905, when he left, was a very difficult time for Warsaw, because another wave of pogroms was just finishing. So I think it was really hard for them to kind of imagine what the future held for them. And so they got jobs as manual laborers in one of the watch factories. And Marcus actually proved himself very quickly. He turned out to be a very entrepreneurial man with a very good initiative. And very soon he was working. So he couldn't have become a skilled artisan, I think, because by the time he arrived in his mid-20s, he was already too old to kind of really learn the craftsmanship of making the intricate mechanisms of the watches. But because he did have really good kind of entrepreneurial spirit and management ideas and intuition, I suppose, he rose very quickly to the kind of management level, and he was working within, like, for the next 10 years he would spend relocating around the area to different towns and helping his bosses set up new workshops. And the whole industry was going for a lot of upheaval and kind of changes at the time, so it was really interesting for him. But within 13 years, by the end of the First World War, he was moving his family to Geneva and setting up his own factory. So he did really well for himself. And he had two daughters, my grandmother's first cousins, Ava and Eugenia, we call her Genya. And so those were actually I have photos, I better not forget, I always do. I have photos that I'm going to show you. And these are the photos of the cousins. So this is Genya, the younger daughter of Adolphe. And I have, and this is Ava. And so these are the photos of her first cousins that my grandmother received in the post when she was a child growing up in Moscow. And so the two daughters, by the time they moved to Geneva, they were already, they spoke Swiss German. That was the language in the house, because especially at the beginning when they were younger, they did switch to French in the end. Being the language of Geneva. But I think Adolphe's experience of first moving was also quite difficult, because they tried to assimilate in, like, among the locals. They didn't really want to be seen. I mean, they tried to hide their Jewish practices, because there was also a lot of prejudice in Switzerland as well. And particularly also, from the local Jewish community, because the local Jewish community was in the bigger cities around Zurich and in the French and Alsace. And there was prejudice from them, because it hadn't been that long since they got all their freedoms and all their rights, and they were much better established. And suddenly you had the influx of poorer, or much poorer, people from Eastern Europe, and they didn't want to be associated with that. So it was a really tricky time for them as well. But when they moved to Geneva and Adolphe established his watch factory and met other Eastern European Jews who, like himself, had made a life of and assimilated, that's when they kind of went back to their practices. And also because Adolphe's wife, Marie, actually came from quite a religious family. So that's when it also became a learning experience for the daughters, because suddenly in their teens, they started discovering about being Jewish, and it all started making more sense to them, the dishes that the mother had cooked, and the language that they could hear their parents speaking amongst each other. And I thought that was really interesting to me as well, but there was a clear parallel from kind of my upbringing, because I came to London when I was 15 and went to university, and it was only at Nottingham, and it was only when I was at Nottingham and my best friend happened to be Jewish. I didn't know she was, but we became friends, that I started learning about my Jewish identity, and we went to join JSOC and started going to Friday night dinners. That's when I was finally able to ask all the questions that had been kind of on my mind. And I felt like eventually, when I was writing the book, I felt that my own kind of all the knowledge, everything came at the same time as it did for Ava, in a sense. She discovered there is a really clear parallel, interesting kind of account in the book, of where I talk about the very first Passover dinner that I had gone to, and no one had told me that you have to read the whole book before you eat. And she had a very similar experience, thinking, is this going to be the only Jewish festival where you don't get any food? And I thought that was really striking, that it was 100 years apart, and we'd had such different kind of paths, but we were kind of united in that sense.
It's an interesting theme, isn't it? That the
Yeah,
Judaism is sort of buried because it's safer, but even though it gets buried, it always seems to come back. The roots and the shoots carry on, don't they, later down the line? I mean, one of the things that I loved about the book was the strong women that are in it. I mean, you are blessed with a family of incredibly strong and determined women who move themselves and their children around the world. But they did have each of them several marriages quite often, and I I wondered whether this sort of maybe it was a question of not settling, that they were married but that they weren't happy. They found it not easy, but they acceptable to just move on. And I wondered whether that you think that is perhaps a product of the uncertain times that they were living in.
I think it's quite tricky, because I think their experiences were very different. My grandmother was married 3 times, but her first 2 husbands died. Well, actually, she separated from her second before he died. But I don't know, those were very difficult. So with my grandmother, it was quite tricky because she's quite a negative person. And I think partly it's her personality, that's just who she is, but also it's obviously everything that she's lived through, and the uncertainty, and the kind of lack of trust, and not knowing who to trust, and all the different experiences. She always said that, all her husbands were useless and never really had anything good to say about them. Even though at the time, obviously, life for her as a single mother was much harder. So that's why I think she ended up kind of like committing herself to these relationships. Like, for example, my grandfather, my mum's father, he passed away when my mother was 10, and they had already been separated for quite a few years before then. My grandmother thought that life would be easier if she had a man to help her out, to provide, but it didn't turn out to be like that, because they just weren't compatible, and they even got worse. So I think it's really hard to judge, because, like, for example, for Ava, her cousin, who found herself in Belgium because she married in the 1930s, she married a Jewish man of Russian, kind of from Russia as well, who had already moved to Belgium. His family were diamond traders, so they were all living in Antwerp. And so she moved into Antwerp with him, and they survived. Well, she survived. She ended up escaping and moving back to Switzerland in the end. He had a much kind of worse, it was much worse for him, but she then ended up marrying someone else who she had actually fallen in love with before she married her first husband. But then I also know, like, she also had an affair during the war while she was living with her husband in Brussels after they fled Antwerp. She also had an affair with a family friend, and that was a really kind of mad and passionate story, which I discovered thanks to Ava's diaries. And I was completely, like, I was so surprised. I didn't expect it. We know about the Holocaust. We know about what we do know, about living under occupation, under Nazi occupation in Belgium. The last thing I was expecting from her diaries was this mad, passionate account of this amazing love affair that changed her life. But I think that's just who she was, because not all her affairs are actually in the book. I didn't feel like I could put all of them in there. And I didn't know
anymore.
I don't know whether I was naive, but I just didn't think that happened back in the day. But obviously, of course not. I mean, I guess it did. And actually it was, but that's also, like, quite a sad story at the same time, because Anita, Ava's daughter, she was the first one who had alerted me to this affair. So when I was reading the diaries, I wasn't surprised that it was there. I just didn't know how passionate it had been. But from Anita's point of view, her mother had this affair. Her father didn't survive. Her mother then moved back to Brussels, moved back to Geneva, where they were living, and eventually remarried, and and then had other affairs and all sorts of things. But from Anita's point of view, she never got another father, and so that created this massive problem for them in their relationship. That they, I mean, in a sense, they reconciled towards the end of Ava's life, and they were on speaking terms, and it was all kind of okay on the surface. But I think talking to Anita now, I can see that she's not over it. Of course not. She's in her mid-80s and she lives in Geneva, and it's still a very kind of traumatic thing that she doesn't really talk about. So I think, I don't know if you can kind of compare, in a sense, all those like multiple marriages, because Genya as well, Ava's sister, she was also married twice and then had a partner whom she wasn't married to, but they were together for 50 years. I think all those stories are different in a sense, and they had multiple kind of relationships for different reasons. But I think what's striking about them all is that they are incredibly strong women. And I didn't really realize the extent of that until I was on my side, with my grandmother, until I was interviewing her, and she would tell me all these, you know, stories, everything that happened to her. And I remember, and she had this another kind of woman who's not part of the family, but who features in the book, is my grandmother's friend Malia. And she is very important because she was the one person outside of her own family that my grandmother could trust amid all the, you know, upheavals and repressions and the paranoia and people reporting on each other and telling on each other to the authorities. There was one person that my grandmother was friends with since she was a little girl and went to school with Malia, and they maintained this friendship their whole lives. And Malia passed away a couple of years ago, and she was living in Boston. And I remember when I was doing all these interviews with my granny, I said to her, you know, this is, can you imagine, you know, you're in London, Malia is in Boston, and you speak on the phone once a week and you share all these experiences and stories from the past. You know, could you have ever imagined that this would happen? And she just looked at me like I was completely crazy. And she said, of course not. Like, we didn't have time to contemplate. We had to get through, you know, we had to get through the present. We couldn't think about the future. And I thought that really struck me because, you know, on both sides, in all the countries that where my family were, you know, in Russia, in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Genya was in Tel Aviv during the war. They just had to get on with it. Their husbands were busy either working or trying to find work, or Genya's husband was fighting with the British, well, he was a doctor with the British Army. And they were left on their own, looking after the children, worrying about their relatives. Genya was incredibly concerned about her sister in Belgium because she was getting reports of what was happening, but all the letters were censored out, so she couldn't get reliable information. And I think that's kind of something that really is very important in this book, because it is in the end about women, despite it starting with the two brothers who kind of established this like separation, but then it is all about women.
Absolutely, and I think that the book is so much stronger for that. But I am a woman reading it. Do you think, as a piece of historic writing, that history is best understood when it's seen through the prism of individual people, rather than the broader scale that we often study history through?
I think so. I think absolutely. I think just the kind of feedback I've been getting as well from friends and colleagues and those readers who have kind of got in touch with me, they all tell me about their stories, their family stories. Oh, and this similar thing happened to me, you know, and my grandmother was there. And I think that's really striking, because usually when you read a history book, you kind of read it and you memorize the names of the military leaders or the political leaders and what happened and the main events, but you don't really come away from it thinking, oh, I wonder what my grandparents were doing at that time. You know, the way history is taught is very different, and we always kind of learn it from the point of view of the power makers, of the decision makers, of the, you know, of wars, but we don't really hear what happens to, you know, the women who are left behind, or behind, you know, at home and not fighting, or even how, you know, simple political events affect daily lives, you know, not even just about war, but even like with, you know, the new economic policy, what happens to the families of those men who had been exiled, or what happens to the men who had tried to, you know, were committed and they were idealistic and they did what they were told to do and they helped, contributed, and then, you know, a change of power and what happens to them. Yeah, I think absolutely. And it just brings it home. And we all have families, you know, whether they are Jewish or not, or whether they are from Europe or America, or, you know, every family will have that. And I think that we definitely relate better when we can kind of compare it to our own experience.
I'm just going to ask you one more question, and then we'll perhaps open it up so that other people can jump in. I work for the Association of Jewish Refugees. We are very much involved with Holocaust remembrance, but there's often a debate around the value of remembrance. Does it have real significance today? And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, I think it does. And I think that was also partly why I was writing the book. And it really hit home while I was writing it, because there is a story in the book of Ava and Anita, her daughter, and it's quite an extraordinary account. They were caught up near Dunkirk during Operation Dynamo, when Dunkirk was suddenly, you know, when Nazi forces were advancing, and the famous call that Churchill had made for the British army to evacuate on small boats across the channel. They had been just north of Dunkirk, across the border in Belgium on holiday, when Belgium became occupied, and they fled south to France and then ended up being stranded in northern France, and they were trying to walk south, like trying to walk away from the German troops. What they didn't realize is that they were encircled, and eventually they came to but they walked for 6 weeks, and Anita was 5 at the time, and it was a complete, they became refugees overnight. And so I was reading Ava's diaries, recounting all that. I was writing that story. And at the same time, because I work for the BBC, I'm a journalist, I'm a news producer, so I'm often in the newsroom, in the gallery, looking at all the different screens from all the agencies. I was writing it this summer when all the refugees were streaming across Europe. They were walking across Hungary. Hungary was closing the borders, they were trying to get to Germany. And Reuters, I remember this very clearly, Reuters had this feed that was positioned somewhere along the railway lines, and you can just watch that feed for hours, and you can just see women and children and young men just walking, and I mean, say what you will about what happened and everything, but they were people fleeing, and I was writing about my family fleeing and trying to escape, and that was just that parallel, and that's why I think it's important, because these things are still happening. They were happening to the Syrian refugees, they happened to the Yazidi women in Iraq during the Syria conflict, they're happening in Africa. That hasn't gone away. And I think if we kind of learn our own stories and we write about our own experience, we can draw those parallels and we can learn from them. That's why I think it's so important, because yes, like the Holocaust finished and there's all sorts of other kind of things happening to the Jewish community, obviously, but there are other things, women and children were separated from their parents on the US-Mexico border, and that's America. So I don't know, I feel very kind of strongly about it, especially in the context of my own family, when I imagine that. And one thing that happened to me while I was writing this book is I had 2 children as well. So I think that transformed my kind of experience and how I feel about it as well, having become a mother myself. So I think absolutely, we have to remember, and we have to be able to kind of look at the bigger picture as well and apply our own past, our own stories and experiences to the wider kind of world, because unfortunately it's just not stopping.
Nadia, thank you. I'm going to open it out now and ask anybody to put their questions to Nadia.
Oh, something in chat. Well, while people are thinking, I know I always kind of forget about the photos, but I thought I will just show you maybe another one. So this is my grandmother and her cousin Genya when they met for the first time in Geneva. This is Genya on the left and my grandmother Anna on the right. My grandmother was 86 at the time and Genya was 97. And this is the very first time that they met, having written to each other as little girls. And it was a very emotional experience, because even while we were planning it, we were kind of aware of it. You are family, we are related, but we didn't know how it was going to go, whether we were going to hit it off, like what language do we all speak together. Luckily, they had German in common. My grandmother had studied and taught German in Russia her whole life, so she's fluent. And Genya obviously spoke German because she learned it as a child, but also because I think in Switzerland they kind of all do. And so they were very lucky to be able to kind of have that in common and speak, and that really broke the ice. But I just wanted to kind of show you that. I see someone's got the raised hand, Peter.
Yeah, that's a really lovely photo. Peter, yes, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That was, really compelling, and I'm going to get the book now. So I'm going to, that's really looking forward to reading it. I've been doing research on my family history recently, partly because I've reconnected with a cousin I didn't know I had in America, in Texas, in Houston, and he's really good at digging out old records. And my father and his 2 sisters were brought up in Vienna, but for some reason his older sister was born in Switzerland, and I'm still researching into how that happened and how the family came to be in Switzerland. And that was just towards the end of that was probably about, I think his older sister was born in 1917, and at that time, around the time of that war, there was movement there, and I'm still looking into how that happened, and a lot more documents are becoming available now. and there are documents like Melderzettels that are revealing a lot more information. And the other point I wanted to make was about the role of women in the story that you brought out so strongly. And it just happens that yesterday Israel elected a new cabinet, and there are now nine women.
Yeah,
Cabinet,
I saw
which
that.
I think is a record number of Jewish female ministers in Israeli cabinet, and that will be very interesting.
No, absolutely. I saw that as well. Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think it's interesting what you say about the movement, because people did just move about, you know, I think quite freely. And when I went to visit the little village where Adolf had first settled in Switzerland, we found they have in one of their museums, I think it was the local archives, they have this massive book that basically everyone who went in and out of the canton, you know, the area, what their name was written in and out. And you could just see Adolf was going back and forth all the time. You know, he was going for work, he was going, you know, I don't know what else. But it was really remarkable to me to just see how much people actually moved about.
If anybody has a question, you can either put up your digital hand or just raise your hand in your Zoom window. Jane, nice to see you. You want to unmute?
Nice to see you too. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And you're obviously a brilliant researcher. And so I'm trying to find some information about my father, who I think was born in the Crimea. I know he was born in 1919, but I'm absolutely stumped as to how I can find out where he was born. He could well have been born in China, because his family, like so many Russians, went to Harbin and then settled in Shanghai eventually. But actually finding birth records, have you got any advice on that in Russia?
Possibly. There's a, what are they called? JRI index. Have you heard of them? I'll have to look it up, because I did some research for another branch, different side of the family. I'm quite into genealogy. I'm trying to remember what they're called, GRI index, I think. They're basically, it's like a US funded charity organization, I'm not sure, and they are digitizing all the records from the Pale of Settlement from Eastern Europe.
Is that sorry to interrupt you, but is that part of Jewish Gen?
I think so, possibly.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do check in with them all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Thanks.
One other thing is, you know, on Facebook there is a group called Jewish Tribe or something, genealogy. And they are all people who are really into genealogy. You know, if you go on my website, if you can drop me a line, because I can then, sorry, this is it. This is my website there. And through that, you can email me. And if you do that, then I will, I'll find the name of that Facebook group, and maybe someone there might have an idea of what you can do, because they're all really into kind of Jewish genealogy, and they're constantly sharing photos and asking each other for help to translate, you know, gravestones and all sorts of things.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
No problem. Good luck.
The Facebook genealogy groups, or Jewish history, or they come under various names. If you just do a search on Facebook, there's a number of them out there. Some of them are just British Jewish history. The JRI, I just Googled while Nadia was saying JRI index, and that it comes up JRI-Poland.
I think they have multiple. I think Jane is right. It is part of Jewish Gen. And then they have, so I was obviously doing Poland, but I do remember them being separate ones, JRI for different, you know, countries, well, the current countries, Lithuania and Belarus.
I wonder whether, you know, sort of Jane was saying that she thought her family came from a certain part of Ukraine, in the Crimea. My family come from, well, part of my family come from the Crimea, Sebastopol. So that might be interesting for our records, but
yeah, I mean, the problem with all these records is that, you know, did they survive? Because some were destroyed in the pogroms, some would have been destroyed. I mean, I know we're talking about later, but just generally speaking, some were destroyed in fires, some were destroyed in accidents, and then the ones that did survive, it's a matter of finding them and then slowly digitizing everything. And I found really difficult is the surnames. The spelling of the surnames is all over the place, because in some parts they were written in Russian, in some different times as well, obviously depending on who was controlling the area at the time. Sometimes they were written in Polish, sometimes they're written in Yiddish, and then when you kind of try to put them into English, the spelling is very different. So it's, I mean, if you're into that, I think it's a really interesting process, but it can be quite frustrating.
Sharon just wants you to just recap, saying, was your grandfather's name Adolphe, and was that a problem? I think it was a very common name at the time.
I think it was a very common name at the time. Yeah, absolutely.
It was, but I was wondering, did it become a problem?
I don't think so. I mean, they never. So it was not my. He's my great grandfather's brother.
Oh yes,
on the Swiss side. Yeah, no, that's fine. No, no one's ever mentioned it. I think like in the Jewish community, it was obviously quite a common name. And afterwards, yeah, no, I don't think so. No.
Any more questions? Just put your hand up whilst you're thinking about it.
Can I just ask another question?
Go on.
No, I've had the lion's share of questions today. But there was something that I was dying to know, that at the very beginning of the book, the two boys are in Poland, and they are with their mother, and their mother has been abandoned by her husband, Nachman, I think, and he had gone off to America to seek his fortune with the intent of bringing his family over, but never did. And I just wondered, did anybody or did you ever find out what actually happened to him?
Yes, that's a very good question. So let me just show you the photo first. This is the two boys with their parents. And just to kind of say a couple of words about the photo itself, this dates from 1891. So we're extremely privileged to have a photo this old in our archive. And I didn't know it existed until I was well on my way of writing the book. I found it in Genya's daughter Ariane. I was staying with her in Geneva, and I was doing all the interviews and just getting to know the family, and she said she had an errand to run, and she said, look, there's a whole cupboard full of photo albums, be my guest. And I started looking through them, and this is the photo that I discovered. And so the two, Marcus and Adolphe, are little boys, and Nachman, so I think this is the photo that they took just before he left. He went to America. And as far as we were concerned, and in Russia, on my side of the family, that was the end of that. And actually, when I first contacted Ariane, because she's the one who put the family tree together on the website through which I found them, when I contacted her, that was the story I told her, because I was very kind of worried about getting in touch in case, you know, she didn't know about us or she didn't like believe me or whatever. So that was the story that I told her. Later I found out that actually Adolphe got in touch with his father. Nachman was living in Washington, and I think it was after, possibly even maybe even before the First World War, that the whole family went there to stay with him, to meet him. And they stayed for a couple of months, and they came back, and they never spoke of him again. And there is no record of what happened to him. And I'm wondering whether maybe Nachman had another family, because he never sent for his family. He never, you know, gave them any news or anything. And I've been trying to find him unsuccessfully at this point, but I kind of decided quite early on that he wasn't going to be part of this book, because, you know, I had to kind of tell the story of the two brothers. And I will try to find it. I will put more effort into it, because I think it would be interesting to see if he did have family, if there are any descendants. We've also just done the 23andMe test, so we'll see if suddenly some cousins appear that we don't know about. Maybe that will tell us more. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a question mark over this.
Can I ask, did your researchers throw up other stories, maybe not directly related to your family, but were intriguing anyway, which because when we were doing our research, we were just coming into the last phase of our heritage project on JSCN. But during the course of that, our researchers, they were all investigating their personal bit of research. It wasn't their families, it was in their location, and they each had a location. But what happened was that they then started sharing the research that they had. And these were disparate locations across the UK. And their personal stories started getting involved in these researches. So where one researcher was working in the south of England, another researcher was working in the northwest of England, and there was somebody who had been an evacuee during the war, and all of a sudden that evacuee, the name resonates, and the other researcher says, we've got somebody with that name in our family. And we started getting all these connections between all these different areas of research, which were never intended to, it was not an area of research to look at. Did you find that there were intriguing connections that came out?
Well, yes, actually, and this is the first time I've actually thought about it since I wrote the book. No one's ever asked this, but it was actually really tricky, and I still haven't got an answer to this. And there is a photo. Oh, I don't have it on me, but in the book there is a photo. There's this guy who was so Adolphe's wife Marie. She had like 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and one of the brothers was called Adash. And he, I think we're not quite sure what happened to him. He was like living in Switzerland, and then he was like popping up everywhere. Apparently he died in London. But then I was going through my grandmother's photos, and I saw a photo of my grandmother in Moscow in, I think, 1930s with her father Marcus and this Adash. And I've always had this really big question, like, how did he end up getting into Soviet Russia? You know, it was already dangerous in the 30s to have any contact with anyone abroad, and you know, the authorities were kind of cracking down. But I'm just trying to see what page it's on. But my grandmother knew him under the Russian name Ilya. Yeah, it's on page 102 if anyone's got a copy already. And we never really reconciled that. We don't know what happened. So I've actually put that photo in the book in the hope that maybe someone contacts me and says, oh, we know Adash Malach, because that's how the Swiss know him. And on the website where I have all my photos, there is that story as well. I think it is very interesting because I would love to kind of uncover that mystery. And I've searched all the UK archives, Jewish UK archives that I could think of under all the different names to see whether he did actually die in London. But I think that's quite tricky given that there is no centralized, from what I kind of understand, there's no centralized record of that.
I suppose it'd be a case of checking the newspaper announcements and things.
Yeah, I've tried. I mean, I've tried everything I could do online. I've tried that. So that's in terms of just connections, as you were asking. But in terms of just discovering things that we didn't know and that was surprised us, there was a couple of things. Then for my grandmother, the main thing was that she knew that, as I mentioned, that Marcus had served in the Russian Imperial Army. What she didn't know is that he was decorated for bravery 3 times. He got 3 medals. And I found that in the Russian archives. I worked with a Russian historian just for ease of access, because Russian bureaucracy is, you know, notorious. And so I worked with this historian who kind of already had access and knew where to look. And he found records of Marcus being decorated three times, 3 years in a row. And the reason, and my grandmother was, you know, absolutely astonished. She had no idea. And I think the reason we didn't know is obviously by the time Marcus moved to Moscow, it was the Soviet Union, and there was no kind of, you know, there was no need to flag up any imperial achievements, that's for sure. And so he just wanted to kind of leave that behind him. So that was really interesting for us, and obviously very emotional for my grandmother to kind of find out that her father had been a hero. And the other thing we didn't know, and also was quite an emotional experience, is, so for Anita, who's Ava's daughter, Anita was born in Antwerp. Then they fled to Brussels because they wanted to kind of escape. They felt really claustrophobic in the Jewish community in Antwerp, obviously, because the Nazis were targeting Jews. And Ava thought if they go to Brussels, then, you know, it's a bigger city, they can blend in easier and they can lose themselves there. But she didn't expect the kind of the yellow start and all that followed. But they did settle in Brussels for a couple of years. And then Anita was evacuated from Brussels by the Red Cross. So she was the first one to kind of make her way to Geneva. And then eventually her mother came, but her father didn't survive. He was trying to walk across, so from Belgium, he made his way to France, and then he was arrested in France. But she thought she had been told, and for her whole life until she was like 80, she had been told that he was arrested on the Franco-Swiss border. And she had been told the story she knew was that he had crossed he'd managed to kind of evade the Italian border guards that were guarding the French side of the border, but it was only when he got to the Swiss side that he was arrested by the Swiss and turned back, and that's how he eventually died in Auschwitz. But when I started researching it, and I requested all the archives from, I think it was it also the Red Cross? I can't remember now, but we found the papers and the details of his arrest, and he was arrested in Besançon, which is a completely different, well, slightly different part of France. So he wasn't arrested on the Swiss border, and the Swiss had nothing to do with it. I mean, the outcome is the same, but for Anita, who only in her 80s, who is a Swiss citizen and has lived in Switzerland her whole life, to find out suddenly that the Swiss actually had nothing to do with it, I think that was a really emotional experience, to know that she blamed her own countrymen for so many years, to find out that no, he was stopped by the I don't know about who, but in France. I think that was a big shock.
Yes, there's many sort of contrasting stories, and Fran knows many of them from having conversations with lots and lots of refugees and survivors. And I mean, my own family had an experience in Switzerland, but it's like the title of your book, Worlds Apart. Their experience was worlds apart. I mean, you were either sort of like having traumatic experiences getting into Switzerland, or you were in Switzerland and almost having a charmed life, although trapped during the Second World War. My uncle got tuberculosis. They were living here in this country. My grandmother took him to to recover in Switzerland. This was before the outbreak of war. War was declared, and then they were stuck in Switzerland for the next 6 years without any money.
To be stuck.
Unfortunately, we had relatives there who paid for their hotel for the next 6 years.
Oh wow!
But that meant that my grandmother missed my parents' wedding and all sorts of things like that. But of course, they lived and stayed there in quite good circumstances, although it was paid for by somebody else. But,
yeah, I mean, a lot was happening, I suppose, a lot of upheavals. But I think what was interesting about Switzerland is that there was quite a lot of resistance within the Jewish community to like the authorities. There were a lot of people who were helping refugees and those who were fleeing, trying to get into Switzerland, crossing rivers, crossing forests. I mean, it's a very kind of difficult terrain to access. And when I was researching, so Adolphe, for example, he was working with refugees, and he was a big philanthropist. He had set up a soup kitchen for Jewish students, where he was like working himself, and his whole family members would be, helping prepare the food. And he was donating a lot of money, but it was actually it was on the different side from through Ariane's marriage to her late husband. His family were really, really active in the network of the people who were trying to get people across the border, and it's really fascinating to hear those stories, to the ends to which they went to try and offer safety and refuge to people who would otherwise would have been killed, and those who weren't able to get into Switzerland were.
There were perilous times in one way or another, where
absolutely. I think everywhere,
working to support refugees, or you were a refugee on the run.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any last questions? Coming up to the end.
To the refugees, that wasn't it? That I mean, the Swiss government were not welcoming. In fact, the Swiss government were quite happy to stop people at the border and literally send them back to their death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of kind
of, I think, as they're painted.
No, absolutely, and there's a lot of controversy around it, and obviously the numbers are very controversial. No one knows exactly how many people they turned away. And the commission, they had the Bergier Commission, which had found a very, I can't remember, like tens of thousands who had been turned away. Recently, last year, I think there was another article that's kind of disputing that. And I haven't been able to kind of get into that in detail, but I think there are grounds to believe that the article might be correct as well with their findings. But I think, the Swiss government took a very kind of controversial position. there are certain things that I've read and been told about to kind of try and not obviously justify it, but to kind of try and understand it a little bit. I think it goes back to the same, reasoning, the prejudice that I was talking about earlier about Adolphe, that he first encountered when he moved to Switzerland in 1905. The Swiss Jews, the majority of them had been really well established. They were part of the kind of the structure of society. They didn't see themselves as the same people that were fleeing. They were kind of different, and potentially that might explain, or not even explain, but potentially there's maybe some kind of reasoning of why they were not really sympathetic to the plight of the refugees. But obviously, like, it's really hard to know, and the position of the government was definitely controversial. Absolutely.
Well, Nadia, thank you so much, and thanks to Fran. There's a backstory going on in the chat. I won't bring it up now.
Oh, I haven't seen the chat. What is the story with the black shoes? I hadn't spotted that. Shall I put my website back up for all the photos? Shall I show it to you again?
If you just bring it up for a moment.
Yes, so all the photos are on it, and you can contact me, you can get in touch, and also all the links for buying the book are also on the website. So
thank you so much for inviting us to read your book, and and for you telling us all about sort of these backstories behind the book itself, and the personal intrigue that's gone into it, and all the research. How long did it take you to write the book, by the way?
Oh, long time, but the children happened. So, about 7 years altogether, but the writing and then a lot of editing, and so yeah, it was quite a lengthy process. And the traveling, I went everywhere. I had to travel, visit, research. So
well, that's amazing. It's a good job you didn't start writing the book last year, because of course that would have been impossible.
Absolutely.
So thank you to Nadia. Thanks to Fran for being our In Conversation leader today. And one event that I want to flag up before I remind you about next week's event is coming up in a couple of months' time. I know it's a long way off, but we want you to save the date. The 3rd and 4th of September. It's the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. We are marking it as Small Communities Shabbat. We are asking everybody to join in one Shabbat over the whole country. If you're in a remote location, whether you're in a small community, whether you're having Friday night dinner by yourself, or whether it's with family, or whether it's with community, this is going to be the one Shabbat for all small communities and anybody who lives remotely. We're going to put it on social media. We'll be sending it out in emails. We'll have a goodie bag which you can get hold of, and we're just working out the details of how to sort that out, but we were just talking about what's going in it this morning. It's going to be fantastic. So everybody can decorate their Friday night table, and you can take a photograph of it before Shabbos comes in, and we're going to post that on our pages. So next week we have another author, like I said at the top of the meeting. We're going to have Titania Michaels with another Swiss connection. It's Swiss Fortnight, who currently lives in Switzerland and came from the Ukraine. And I'm not quite sure where she's going to be joining us from, whether it's Switzerland or the Ukraine, because I know the other week she was talking to us from the Ukraine when we were setting this up. But she has an intriguing story. So join us again at 10:30 next week. Thanks again to Nadia, to Fran, to all of you for coming and coming in out of the sunshine. Well, except Jackie, who is in the sunshine. And we hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to tell anybody else, we'll be putting the link on our Facebook page, and it'll be up on YouTube shortly within the next few days. So until next week, thanks to everybody for coming. See you then.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Ed.
Bye.
Sorry I joined you late.